Hi, everyone, and welcome to this edition of High Tech Talks. My name is Clark Boyd, as you hopefully know by now, and I'm delighted to say I'm joined today by Tom Goodwin. Now, Tom is the author of the book Digital Darwinism, and he's the co-founder of the digital consultancy All We Have Is Now. Hi, Tom. Thanks for joining.
Hello. Hello. Thank you for having me on. Thank you.
Yeah, Tom, in sunny Miami today, when I'm in dreary old London, but we are going to talk about a big topic that I know I've been mentioning a lot in the newsletter recently, and that is a culture of innovation. How do we define one first? How do we build it? And then how do we sustain it? And we're going to talk about a lot of different components, people, and then later data and technology. I'll explain why. Now, first of all, Tom, let's define this. Now, what do you understand first to mean by a culture of innovation?
Yeah, I don't think you can define these things. That's where these things become quite tricky. You know, in the modern age, we're very keen to ascribe companies a sort of digital quotient score or a sort of, what part of the quadrant are they in? And I think many of these things you can feel and you can find proxies for, but you can't measure. It's not like a sort of box arrives called the sort of 3-step kit to an innovative culture, and then you sort of give everyone a hat, and tell everyone that everyone's ideas are good, and then you have a culture of innovation. What this kind of really links to is, do you have a culture where people feel a degree of support in expressing ideas that are somewhat different? Is there a general alignment to a forward-thinking goal, which allows people's energy to sort of focus on a particular direction? Is there a culture which is sort of supportive of people who think differently? Is there a recruitment process underway, to ensure that there is a sort of diversity of inputs and vantage points? One knows a culture of innovation when one sees one. Is often correlated to other things. Often these are cultures where they feel very much like people embody the growth mindset. Often these are cultures where people have a strong sense of belonging. Often these are cultures where there's a strong sense of fun. There's a strong sense of sort of purpose. There's a strong sense of camaraderie, maybe even lots of gossip. There's no such thing really as a sort of very specific culture of innovation. There are just places that are built in such a way that people are much more likely and able to do their job in an innovative manner, I think.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because I feel like that's the first barrier to overcome. I don't know if it is just a modern phenomenon, but the first thing that we generally want to do, and that I certainly want to do, I've just done it, is say, okay, let's pin this down, and then let's talk about the 5 steps that will get you there. And then at the end of it, you'll know. And I think people do feel a little bit lost or think like things are quite vague. There's so much data and so much talk of change and progress all the time. And people want this sense of validation of, we're doing okay. Look, we are now digital, we're transformed, and we are innovative. We're ready for the future. And we need to kind of overcome that a little bit. One thing you mentioned there was this diversity of opinion and diversity, I guess, much more broadly as well. First of all, why do you think that is such a challenge in business today? Is it a very deep-rooted thing, or is it a specific phenomenon? And how do you start to overcome that?
There's a huge sort of dichotomy when it comes to this, which is that teams that are working really, really well together tend to have a strong sense of alignment. They tend to have incredibly high levels of trust. And that is far more easily accomplished with people who are most alike ourselves. Realistically, one has to look at humanity like a fairly primitive creature. We are still the product of evolution, which means that we are trying to ensure that we don't get eaten, and we're trying to ensure that we have enough to eat, and we're trying to ensure that we procreate. And one of the ways that we do that is by building tribes, because tribes allow us to do things together. And when you're in a tribe, anyone that's different is a dissenter. Anyone that sort of looks very different is a bit foreign. And therefore, I think many natural tendencies are to find the easiest way to build a tribe, which is people who support the same football teams, people who come from the same cities, people who watch the same TV shows. It's wonderful to go into an office in the morning and talk about, the Will Smith Oscar incident. And if you have someone going, who's Will Smith? Everyone feels a bit awkward about it. So we are sort of designed really to optimize around togetherness and similarity. But at the same time, any progress is always only going to come from difference. It's a bit like sort of mutations in the gene and evolution. And therefore, the way to go about unlocking this sort of tension, I think, is to have very mature and adult and honest conversations about this. Because people always say they want this. People always say, oh, it'd be great if we could have people who are very different to us working here. And they put out a brief for consultants to recruit people like that. And then very quickly on day one, when they don't know who Will Smith is, or when they're a bit autistic, or when they've got like a really sort of lower class accent, we suddenly feel a bit awkward about the whole thing. And we're not quite sure how to create a culture which is much more inclusive. And I think if we can be much more honest about this stuff, and if we can be much more sort of realistic about it, and if we can really, really, really understand the benefit of this and understand the challenges that it brings about, that's how we can unlock this tension. But we're in this sort of weird middle stage where we've been told that this is a good idea. And I think many companies are not really that comfortable. Many companies are not. Some of the most brilliant people I've ever met have been people who never even thought about going to university. At the start of the pandemic, I think I was trying to sell like some old Bose headphones that I didn't need. And I went out to Queens and I sold them to this sort of kid who was about 15. And when I was there, he was like, do you want a pool? And I was like, what? He was like, do you want a pool? I was like, I thought it was like a new drug or something. I was like, the pool thing sounds interesting. I was like, what's that? And he's like, like a paddling pool. I was like, why do you want a paddling pool? He was like, well, it's April. All the swimming pools are going to be closed down for the rest of the year because of the pandemic. If you've got kids, you'll need a swimming pool. And it suddenly dawned on me that this was a futurist, better than any futurist I'd ever met, far better than me. This is someone who could sort of see the second order implications. This is someone who has invested his money in this. And he's the sort of person that in another world I'd have brought into publicists and said, look, this kid's only 14 or 15, but let's find a way for him to be in brainstorms. But then I kind of thought, actually, it's going to be hard. Like, you're going to have to, get people to bend rules, and he's probably too young to earn a proper salary. And you suddenly realize that we're not quite equipped with all of the realities of what this means. And I think the more that we can have companies that have a real sense of alignment and camaraderie and togetherness, but also are in love with weirdness and awkwardness and unexpected things and serendipity. But that's hard. Like, people are designed to be comfortable.
Yeah. I know this isn't much of a hard luck story, but I was interviewing with a big ad agency probably about 5-6 years ago now, and just as I was about to leave the room, the CEO said,
violin for you.
This is devastating. In fact, a violin is very fitting, actually, Tom. So he said to me, "It's like, just one more question. What music do you listen to?" Classical music. He went, "See, it wouldn't work. You just wouldn't fit here. It's a no." And I was like, okay, I'm just going to class this place up for you. I'll tell you. This agency has no idea what it's just missed out on. Now, it turned out to be fortuitous for both of us. They've gone on to do great things, and I probably would not have done very well there. But I found it really interesting. And I thought afterwards, I've never seen people be that open about something like that. But he just said, we just know what kind of people we want here, and the team wouldn't take well to someone who doesn't have the same cultural interests as them. Okay.
I was going to say, what's amazing is not that the person felt that way; it's that they felt comfortable enough to express it. And I think, in all honesty, there is a time and a place. I mean, if you're sort of building a company with 3 people, and then you bring in a 4th person who's sort of wildly different in every single way, it probably is very challenging. Like, when you're sort of 1 to 10 people, you probably need alignment more than anything else. You probably need people that will say yes to things and not ask why. But then you get to a point where you're being ridiculously blind to possibilities by forcing this sort of homogeneity to a place. But again, like, people have got to want it. People have got to feel People have got to see the value in this stuff. And I think most people have not really bought into this in the way that one would imagine yet.
Yeah, 'cause, I mean, we don't really build in, as much as people like to talk about how uncertain everything is and how crazy it is and it's all changing all the time. Everything is so stable within businesses. And the notion of, I mean, not me, I mean, my jokey example aside, I'm talking, genuine people who have a very contrasting opinion, who we maybe do believe deep down we would like them to come in and challenge us. We're not necessarily prepared for it in terms of how we do things. So what if they pulled the plug on a project that we were about to launch that everyone was aligned on? And it might be the right thing to do, but we won't know. And maybe they're just getting in the way. And that's what I've seen quite often, is that it's almost like bring people in. And I've been at agencies that have scaled really, really quickly. And we realize, we're getting very samey here. We need more people in who have different opinions, different backgrounds, and so on. And you get some challenging people who, challenge the status quo, like we say we want in our job advertisements. But then they come in and actually they derail things, and it ends up having a negative impact, and we're not prepared for it. We actually haven't built that into things that we're doing. And I had this idea, another idea last week of the non-sultancy, where essentially the idea would be you go in and tell people not to do things they're doing. We're not going to consult, we're going to non-sult. We're going to tell you this is nonsense, it's the wrong thing to do. You don't need to be in the metaverse. Your bank is fine in the real world, but your customer data is a mess. So maybe go and fix that instead. And we do that. And you always need to have that sort of a thing built in, because what we've often found, and this is smaller businesses I'm talking about, but is that people who go against the status quo just disrupt, and the whole thing, and not disrupt in a good way, put things out of joint, and maybe take a project off track that you're about to launch Facebook creative across 30 markets, and this person says that that's not going to work for the audience. Well, so what do we do? Do we just not launch this whole campaign? Do we lose millions of dollars? No, you carry on and you ignore them, and they end up feeling completely marginalized. So I don't know what the answer is to these things, of course, but building in that sense of uncertainty is very difficult for businesses.
I think the answer is twofold, actually. One is you have to really want it. Every time, it doesn't happen very often, actually. I think I might be quite unemployable now, but occasionally people try to recruit me. And the first question I always ask is, do you really want what this means? And obviously people are quite threatened by that. But lots of people like the idea of merchandising a bit of disruption. Lots of people like the idea of people who with a sort of generalist mindset. Lots of people like the idea of a sort of bit of provocation. But most companies are not really prepared for all of the implications of that. And, there was a while ago when lots of agencies had sort of chief innovation officers, chief disruption officers, chief transformation officers, CIOs and stuff. And really what your job was to do was to find out how well you should do your job to allow yourself to sort of remain there long enough to keep your job so you can actually bring changes. Because if you came in on day one and you were like, actually, everything you're doing is kind of wrong, you need this, and this, you need to recruit people like that, and that, people would be very quick to get rid of you because you'd be too disruptive. And that's fine. And actually, really, the way to survive is to be quite useless at your job. It's just sort of go around praising people, say that the room that's got all the brightly colored sofas is the perfect place for great ideas, and then sort of start to sort of dig in here and there, pick your battles, then sort of bring people with you, and then try to make the organization much more innovative. But it's a very long process. And normally because you're sort of comfortable and because you're not really making a difference for a long time, normally your job's not really that sustainable for that long. You hit on a really nice point, actually, which is, for all of the talk about these being sort of volatile, uncertain, crazy, fastest changing times ever, we're kind of addicted to high levels of comfort. I mean, most people in most sort of corporate units, we have no idea what discomfort really feels like. Like our sort of tolerance of things which are a bit different is remarkably low. Most people sort of think discomfort is, flying economy class for sort of 5 hours and thinking it should be business. Most people think a meeting where someone says, I'm not sure about the idea. Most people think that's a sort of dissenting voice and quite awkward. And I think one of the elements of this is we have to realize, none of us are going to die in our jobs. We don't have particularly vital jobs where a bad day means that, the entire stock market collapses. we can actually afford to be really quite rambunctious and challenging and provocative. And no one should feel that that's a difficult situation, but sadly, we're very sensitive to this stuff.
So if you were then in charge of trying to hire people, and let's forget the role, really, thinking more generally about maybe mindset as much as anything else, what would be the few things you would look for more than anything else?
One of the things I love that you said there is sort of hiring people rather than the role, because I think that's one of the challenging things. Is most recruitment in most companies is we have this space in the machine. How do we find the best person to fit precisely in it? And actually, a key thing that should happen in recruitment, in the right circumstances, is that we find brilliant people, and then we figure out what the hell to do with them. I think you need people who are quite optimistic. I know that sounds like an unexpected first thing to say, but there's so much cynicism in the world. And you don't need people to say go around with a smile on their face every day as if they've sort of swallowed a bottle of Prozac. But you do need people that have a sense of positivity about the world, because defensiveness is a terrible place to come up with good ideas from. You need people who are quite wide, I think. You need people with sort of interest in lots of different areas with a high level of curiosity. And you need people who are quite unfearful. Again, sort of fear is the great killer of most progress. You need people confident enough to know if they lost their job, they'd be able to find another one. You need people prepared to take risks. You need people who are quite comfortable with being uncomfortable. And then probably, again, these are sort of unspoken things which we find quite unappealing, but probably quite high levels of charisma as well. You need people to sort of bring people with us on this journey. You need people that can sort of corral a group of people, sort of reassure a group of people. They need to sort of have high empathy skills to sell the idea into people and bring them along with them. Those are the kind of things.
Interesting you mentioned that. I mean, not that it's in any way related to me, but that point about charisma. Yeah. Just to preface this, that's not where I'm going with this. This isn't the sales pitch for me based on that. But I was reading the old philosopher Max Weber recently about talking about charismatic authority as being essentially the way historically that people break through bureaucracy and the way that things have been done. And he's writing about this a long, long time ago. I thought it was really interesting because you see so much of it now and consult on digital transformation, and so much of it is that this sense that we can't do anything any differently. And the right leader, the right leadership team anyway, that can take people through it seems to be the difference, where there might seem to be obstacles, but hold tight and keep going and things will get better because we know we're going in the right direction. And it was interesting that word charisma kept coming up and was one of the ways that it was popularized actually as a way of breaking through bureaucracy that we've moved away from a little bit, I think.
The tricky thing is that charisma often sort of correlates quite well with people being sociopaths. And it quite often correlates with like a lack of knowledge, where people with charisma have sort of got through on their careers without knowing anything underneath it. So really, I mean, obviously Steve Jobs is quite an unusual person and not everyone can seek to emulate him, but the ideal combination is a sort of Steve Jobs type person that is charismatic enough to lead people through a process. But then brilliant enough to actually do so with good intentions and with understanding behind it. And instead we get, and I'm calling out Adam Newman is probably a little bit unfair, but we get sort of people that are almost like snake oil salespeople that sort of bring people together on a dream. So one has to be very careful with charisma and sort of ensure that there's enough behind it as well.
Yeah. No, there's definitely a middle ground between the Jobs and the Newman. I'm hoping we can find some of those.